Terrorism is still seen as something outside our remit, an uber crime if you like, something so horrendous, so outlandish that we rarely stop to try to understand it or its origins. But if you want to understand any crime, first you have to understand the motivation behind it. There are hundreds of books on the subject. These shelves are stacked with bedtime reading, all debating those tricky questions like, what is it that makes one man's freedom fighter another man's terrorist? Many of them tackle this crime as a subject to be understood, looking at patterns and similarities down the ages. So, here's my brief history of terrorism. Terrorism is nothing new. The English word terrorism comes from the régime de la terreur that prevailed in France after their revolution. To protect his new French Republic, its leader Robespierre saw to it that 40,000 people lost their lives under Madame Guillotine, including, eventually, Robespierre himself. Acts of terrorism appear as far back as ancient Greece and Rome. Et tu Brute, et tu Guy Fawkes or Lee Harvey Oswald. And some say legendary Swiss national hero William Tell was a terrorist, killing the country's tyrant with a crossbow. An act of terrorism, the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, even triggered the First World War itself. In first century Middle East, the Sicarii targeted those they felt had adopted their Roman occupiers' values, stabbing them in broad daylight in crowded squares to make their feelings widely known. Fast forward to the 8th century, and a sect known as the Assassins killed politicians and clerics, again choosing crowded religious sites on holy days for maximum impact. The killing of such high-profile targets inevitably led to the immediate execution of the assassin. The Indian religious cult, the Thuggis, also sacrificed themselves. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, they strangled travellers as an offering to their Hindu goddess, and are reputed to be responsible for as many as 1 million murders. From the 19th century on, nationalist groups from Russia, Ireland and the Balkans adopted terrorism as a means towards their desired ends. The end of the two world wars saw similar groups arise in defiance of previous colonial masters in countries such as Cyprus, Kenya and Algeria. Then 20 or so years ago, we started to see a shift from the nationalistic aims of groups such as Spain's ETA or Turkey's PKK to a more international focus. Terrorist organizations increasingly started to develop a global agenda and reach, and a global recruitment base. The power of international publicity was harnessed with the hijacking of commercial airliners by a PLO faction in 1968 and 70, and the murder of 11 Israeli athletes at the 72 Olympic Games. The Paris metro was targeted in the 90s by an Algerian group, and in 1993 the first attack on the World Trade Center was carried out by terrorists linked to an Egyptian organization. Then came September the 11th, 2001. This assault by Al-Qaeda and its associate networks confirmed the shift that had been taking place from national to international terrorism. Repercussions are being felt all over the world, with attacks in Madrid, Bali, London, Mumbai and Islamabad. Today, terror is far more indiscriminate. Although our individual risk remains very low, anybody could get caught up in an attack. These days, very few politicians or generals die, but many innocent people do. So are there any lessons we can learn from history that point at what motivates people to kill, apparently in the name of their religion or political ideology? Luckily, one of those books on the shelves was Terrorism, a very short introduction. I went to meet its author, Keele University's Professor of History, Charles Townsend. Hi there, Charles. Nice to meet you. Nice. Now, what I imagine frustrates you as an academic is being asked to write a very short history of anything. But can you give us a relatively simple definition of terrorism?
Well, I think it has to do with using violence to try and change a political system. And it's violence that's targeted usually on defenseless people, because that's the way it creates the most impact. And it is about achieving impact. It's violence that's intended to play on public fears, make people anxious, in the hope that this will generate some kind of pressure for the sort of changes that terrorists want to achieve.
Are there common causes of terrorism within societies?
Well, I think you can say pretty clearly with nationalists that it's a question of an ethnic group that believes that it has a right to be independent and that it's being oppressed by another group or a state. But there are also these more abstract revolutionaries who want to change the whole world. They don't simply want to liberate one part of it.
Is there such a thing as a typical terrorist?
No, I think we can say with some certainty there is no such thing as a typical terrorist.
So the flip side of that is that we're all susceptible.
We're all capable of being enthusiasts for a cause, and a lot depends on the shape that that cause takes in our time, what kind of groups are upholding it. Some people are more inclined to join groups than others. But it's within those groups, it's the drift towards the use of violence that is clearly the most interesting question.
I know you're not a sociologist, but can you give a historian's view on the importance of belonging and the social nature of groups?
Yeah, well, clearly membership in groups is vital for most terrorist campaigns. So there have been odd random bombers, but the group dynamic is clearly, as in all human organisation, vital.
Is this out of a basic human need to belong?
For most people, yes. The kind of value placed on you as an individual really has to be provided by other people.
So, no terrorist is an island?
Very few, that's true.
History proves it. The groups we surround ourselves with define who we are and what we do. And a sense of belonging can drive otherwise ordinary people, particularly the young and vulnerable, to extremes.